Today we will be talking about Pope Francis's 50th World Communications Day in 2021. So Pope Francis had been Pope for several years, and during the 55th World Communications Day, he was Pope, and we're going to go over his message. He does mention the pandemic in this message because, as we all know, in the middle of 2021 or the beginning of 2021, we were still in the pandemic. The vaccine had just become available or was becoming available, and a lot going on in the world. One of the first things he mentions is the scripture that says, "Come and see," where Jesus invites the disciples to come and see what he's going to do. And Pope Francis was making a distinction between the invitation to come and see versus the "I already know everything that's going on" kind of thing. And so most of us approach life and feeling like we already know everything. You can't tell me anything I don't know. I know how you think and how you feel and whatever, and we're not open to learning about these things from other people. And so this is kind of like the major message that he's talking about in this particular World Communications Day. Confronting reality, which always surprises, he says. Instead of approaching life under the assumption that you already know everything, we should approach life in this idea of going out into the world and actually seeing in front of our eyes the reality, the complex reality in front of us. And he's suggesting that when we do this with an open mind and an open heart, that we're always going to be surprised because we don't know. I don't know what's going on in your life. You don't know what's going on in my life. I don't know what is going on in Chicago or LA or New York, unless I go. And even when I go, I don't know. I only know what I see or what people tell me. But we definitely can't know just by sitting here. We can think we do because we're seeing stuff on a screen, but we know that the stuff we see on the screen nowadays may or may not be true, may not be accurate, may not even be real, might be fake. And so he's suggesting hitting the streets, reporting instead of, and he wasn't just talking about you and me, he's talking also about journalism. He says a lot of reporters stay behind their computer screen and report from there based on what they see online or what other people are reporting instead of actually getting out into the world. Now, some of that is caused by dwindling budgets for news, like traditional news media has had dwindling budgets because not as many of us are supporting or watching or listening or reading, and therefore they can't sell as many advertisements. We have mixed feelings about news organizations having to sell ads anyway, but it's the dwindling budgets that sometimes lead to people sitting behind their computers instead of getting out into the world to do the reporting. It also lends itself to having AI write news stories, the easy news stories, instead of getting out into the world. So, there's a lot of things happening. It's not just us people behind our computer screens like I am today. It's everybody. It's people we would hope would be able to do their job by getting out into the world who aren't able to or are choosing not to. But Pope Francis is suggesting that we all get out there into the streets. He's mentioned in a previous message that he would prefer to have a bruised church out in the streets than prideful church in the pews. So this is a similar message. He'd rather have us be out in the streets confronting the complexities of reality instead of just sitting behind our computer screens and being voyeurs of reality. He says that because of the technology, we're becoming spectators. We're technical spectators instead of having face-to-face experiences. I've mentioned being a teacher. It seems like my students really enjoy when they come to the classroom, they enjoy getting to talk to people, breaking into small groups and having conversations, having these face-to-face conversations instead of just through text message or chat or whatever, email, social posts, whatever it is. And so there is this sense that even if I'm having a so-called conversation with you over a text message, which I'm glad text messages exist. I get to sort of stay in contact with people who wouldn't be able to have a full conversation with me because we're all busy. But we can't act like that's the same thing. It's not the same thing. And so we're still sort of being spectators because it's sort of becoming a form of entertainment, me reading my text messages instead of me having a conversation. So I get what he's saying. He also says any instrument is only valuable if it gets us out to encounter. The phone is great. We're glad to have them. I remember before cell phones, so I'm very glad to have a cell phone. We're glad to be able to call people if we're broken down on the side of the road, which God forbid, I hope we're not. But we're glad to have them, and they are valuable in a lot of ways. But he's suggesting that as far as a form of communication, that technology and these devices and these instruments are only valuable if they actually encourage us to get out and meet. If the church is using email or a newsletter or social media posts to get people to come out and have face-to-face conversations and encounter one another, that he's saying, yes, we're using it well. If even journalism is being used to get people out to have personal face-to-face positive encounters, then we're using it for the way that we should. Unfortunately, probably what we're doing is we're just relying on it too heavily. I mean, one solar flare, it could all be gone tomorrow in an instant, and we wouldn't know what to do. But we're using it a lot to just kind of have surface level. I mean, I have some pretty deep conversations in text messages, honestly. But Pope Francis would say it's not the same. We need to get out. We need to experience one another. And I think sometimes, during the pandemic, we couldn't when we were quarantined. But I think sometimes we get to where we prefer our own energy system, and it becomes difficult to be in other energy systems. And so we kind of lose our ability to be in small groups or large groups or even one-on-one conversations. And so we're relational beings. And when we begin to not be able to do that, then we lose a bit of our humanity in the process. He says the Gospels were like news stories written several years, many years after they actually happened. Some written by the authors that witnessed it. I'm not a biblical scholar, but he uses the example of John's gospel. John witnessed it and then wrote about it. I think he said 50 years later or something, but it, like news reporting, I was there. This is what I saw. This is what I witnessed. This was my experience of it. These were the experiences that I saw of the people that were there. And so he's sharing stories about Jesus, about the other apostles and the disciples, and naming names and telling stories about these people. And I thought that was an interesting comparison to say, hey, back then, this was a news story. Now, those news stories have been sold over and over. I think it was in one of my New York Times puzzles today that the Bible's the best-selling book in the world. So these news stories got sold over and over again, unlike many news stories. But I thought that was an interesting comparison. Faith. Not hearsay, but direct knowledge from experience. Yeah, I think you can hope something's true by being optimistic and not giving up, You might have doubts, but you hope and you trust, and all these words that we use. And you believe, you have a belief in something. But he's saying that faith, his definition of faith is actually a knowing. I think some people might say Faith is one thing and a knowing is another, but he's saying they're the same thing. He's saying faith is based on direct experience. And I think that's true. If you've ever been in a situation where you struggled and you had to rely totally on God, we have those situations in our lives where maybe you are broken down on the side of the road and you have to rely totally on God. And you might have to drive 50 miles at 5 miles an hour. I had to do that one time. To get what you need, but there's always a way, and when you live through something like that, then you have this knowing, you have this faith that yes, God will be there. Now we know tragic things happen and we don't understand it, but what we're talking about is this faith that we develop based on things, experiences that we have. I remember when I got the call that my grandfather had passed away. I think it was in the morning time, and before I got the call where I lived, the smoke detector went off and there was no smoke, so after I got the call that he had passed away, I was like, oh wow, maybe Grandpa set off the smoke alarm. I think he probably did, but that's just you live through something like that, and you develop a faith or a knowing based on an actual experience that you have, what we might call a miraculous experience that we have. Maybe we don't always have miracles, but often we do, and thank goodness, right? Thank God we have miracles. To know, we must encounter for ourselves. You can tell me something, and I might be inclined to believe you that you experienced that in that certain way. But for me to actually have a knowing, I have to experience it. I have to encounter it. I was watching a Hallmark movie yesterday where they were talking about how do you know if you're in love? You just know, they have that knowing based on an encounter. It's an experience like they've never experienced before, and they have an awakening and they go, oh, well, this must be what it feels like to be in love. And they have that personal knowing about it. Yeah. And so we're never going to know. I think we spend a lot of times having these arguments online now and having opinions based on our own life. But if we never get out of our box, if I drive that same road from home to work, to home to work, to home to work, and if I'm only at home and only at work, then I have a really very limited view of the world in my little tiny world, and I may not understand your world at all. Phil Rosenthal has the Somebody Feed Phil show on Netflix. I love Phil Rosenthal and his show, and one of his things is get out into the world. Meet people. He meets people all over the world, sometimes in the United States, sometimes in Vietnam or Brazil or wherever he is. And just like I've mentioned Paul Salapak, who's out there walking around the world, that same people with similar stories all over. There's language barriers, but the experiences they're having are very similar in an, I guess, archetypal sort of way, but their personal experiences are unique. The culture's unique. The food is unique. The fashion, everything, the colors, the architecture, it's all different. And you're not going to have any knowing about that unless you encounter it for yourself. I'm really hoping to be able to afford to get out and travel more soon. I would love to. I hope I get the opportunity to do that. But that's the only way that we are going to have this personal knowing about other people and other cultures. Pope Francis mentions that journalists have a lot of courage, don't they, though? And he's not talking about the ones that are stuck behind their computers. He's talking about the ones who go out in war zones, who go out and are there during famine and during terrorism and during struggle and during all the different things, genocide. I mean, everything that's happening in the world, the reporters that have the courage to go out there and gather those stories to the best of their ability and sometimes die covering those stories. we thank God for their courage, the grace of courage to do that. We know that the root word for courage is heart. They have the heart to go out into the world and cover these really serious things. Now, on the flip side of that, there's a whole lot of people out there covering a lot of unserious things, maybe influencing about this, that, and the other, and they're doing their part in their lives and in the world and culture. But Pope Francis is saying investigative journalists, these type of people, really adding to our ability to know what's going on. Otherwise, we wouldn't know what's going on. And I know some people just roll their eyes at media in general and don't believe anything. And I that's not the answer either. You can't handle the truth. That's not the answer either. We have to be able to handle the truth. We have to help pay by subscribing to news outlets we believe in, that we feel are truthful, and help the journalists be able to go out there. There are a lot of independent journalists doing it on their own. I don't know how they're surviving. They're selling stories bit by bit. But if those voices go away, the human family would suffer. Absolutely true. We were able to be citizen journalists now we can live feed, do our live video, live feed wherever, and show what's going on in our little piece of the world. But a lot of humanity doesn't have that ability. And if we didn't have journalists out there covering those stories and amplifying those voices, we'd never hear them. And so, yes, our human family would suffer. We don't think enough about how we're all connected. The butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings over here, and the effect is over here, way over here. We don't think about that enough. We don't think about consequences of our own actions and the actions of others. And we wouldn't even hear about it without the journalists out there amplifying those voices. Seeing only through the eyes of richer nations, you get two sets of books. So Pope Francis was saying, if we didn't have these journalists who were going to the far corners of the earth and covering stories, then we would only have the stories that were being provided by the wealthier nations' traditional media. And I'm very pro traditional media and journalism, and I know that a lot of the outlets are trying to do their best to be unbiased and valid and reliable. But just from that perspective, sometimes, we wouldn't hear stories unless individuals were going out there and bringing it back to us. And so he says it's creating like this two sets of books, or it would be, it is, I'm sure, where, we've got the wealthy nations over here with this point of view, and then we've got people going out and getting the perspective of the countries, the poorer countries, and that's another set of books, and we need to compare those. And unless we're going, we don't know. I have friends and family that have done missionary work and loved it, and they always talk about it, and they always want to go back, and they have a perspective about life that I just don't have, and you don't have maybe. And that can create, even if it's not done on purpose, two sets of books that we're dealing with. The poor are always at the end of the line. Pope Francis was particularly speaking about the vaccine in this during the pandemic. He was talking about how it's usually the poor countries, poor people who don't have access to things because they're at the end of the line. And we know that Pope Francis had a heart for the poor, and hopefully also Pope Leo the 14th does too, and we all need to. And I don't have an answer, but I thought it was worth mentioning, and it remains to be true. Probably will always be true, but I hope we can do more to even the playing field, Technology helps with timely firsthand information like emergencies. He didn't want to be down on technology, too down on it in general, but he's saying we're glad that we have it. And when we have an emergency like a hurricane or an earthquake or whatever it is, a war zone or whatever it is, wildfires and things happening, we're glad that we have access to that technology that helps us. Sometimes digital technology will go under, an analog radio will be the thing that where we actually, like during a hurricane, maybe if your electricity's out for a long period of time, it might be the crank radio that you're listening to get the information that you need to stay safe or to find clean water or whatever you're looking for. And we know that not only other countries have struggles with this, but parts of America have certainly struggled during emergencies as well, not being particularly prepared for the level of devastation that they experienced. So yes, we're glad to have our technology then. We are witnesses to news that would be overlooked by traditional media. So he's saying that through citizen journalism, through independent journalists, and through our ability to be connected with technology, we have access to stories we might not hear otherwise, because traditional media might be really focused on what's going on in the stock market or what's going on at the White House, if we're talking about America, or, all this stuff happening, might not hear a story about a tiny island in the South Pacific or something, so we're glad that we have access to technology to hear these news stories all over the world. And I think, we're relatively new to handling all of this. And now we're in the creation of AI creating a lot of things and deep fakes and things. And so we're going to have to learn how to do that. And I think that we're like little children, we're not even adolescents yet. We're just toddlers running around trying to learn how to use this stuff ethically and correctly and with a discerning eye and all of that. And when we don't know yet, we're still learning, we're stretching. It's only going to get worse before it gets better, but maybe eventually we might be using technology correctly like they did on the Enterprise or something. We'll see. We can report what we see and share it with others. I don't often think to do that. Many people are always reporting things, but recently there have been some rallies and things where people go and take pictures and post them online, and even traditional news media pick it up. If you watch traditional news media, sometimes a lot of what they're talking about are posts that regular people have posted, and things you need to know or whatever. So we do have that ability, and that is a good thing until it becomes a bad thing, until maybe they're censoring what we do or putting us on a list because of what we do. We hope and pray that doesn't happen. Although it does around the world. But misinformation is also shared, and rapidly, right? It goes a lot faster than the truth because it just feeds into our hatred and our pain and our fears and all of that. Even though we learned last time that good classic stories are only thousands of years old because of them being truthful, and that misinformation's not going to stand the test of time. It can be in the short term, very destructive because we will spread it and share it. It's like gossip. I'm not going to read a novel about gossip in general, but we can feed on gossip really quick in the workplace or at school or wherever we are. Just because we're just egotistical people, right? So Pope Francis said that it's really just sometimes sheer narcissism that causes people to share misinformation, to post misinformation and then share it. And what do we mean by that? Well, somehow having a group of people believe a certain thing is going to be beneficial to you, even if that certain thing is not true, whether it's to sell more product or to get votes or whatever it is. And it's just sheer narcissism. We're not worried about what is helpful for that group of people. We're not worried about creating products that are good for people. We're not worried about electing officials and leaders who are good for people. We're just trying to win and take and have as much as we can. And that's all just selfishness, and it's pure narcissism. And that's exactly what Pope Francis, I think, was saying there. He did suggest that we don't need to demonize the internet because it is so helpful, but that we need to learn to discern, to have discernment, to be able to tell. There are sometimes instructions out there that you can tell this picture's not right because this earring looks funny on this lady or something. There are ways to discern these types of things. I think as they get better and better, it's going to be harder and harder to do that. And that's why we're going to just have to get out and be face to face, because we're only going to really truly be able to trust what we actually do see. See in person, face to face, not probably going to go through a stage where we don't believe anything that we see online. And maybe that's the way we need to get. But we have to take responsibility for the content that we're sharing, sending, creating, and the content that we're receiving. And I think it's not enough to just trust the person who sent it to you, because they may be well-meaning people who have shared misinformation. And I see it happening a lot online, especially seems like on Facebook to me. But so Pope Francis is saying this is a great tool, but we've got to learn to discern and take responsibility for it. And this was in 2021. And so here where we are now, it's even worse, getting worse every day. And so the responsibility that we take may be just to put it down, and then the question will become, how do we stay up on the news? How do we know what's going on in the world without being involved in all of this sharing of this misinformation? And then will we go back to something like a newspaper? I don't know. I really don't know. We're going to find out. We need to expose fake news, he says. If you see it, you need to tell people it's fake. And I think we're really scared to do that sometimes. We're in a situation where you really can get shunned based on not following the groupthink. You really can. You don't feel the way everybody else does, and you question the stuff that they're spreading because you don't think it's true, and you've looked it up and you say it's not true, and then you get on there and say it's not true. You really can get shunned by a large group of people who might be old friends and family members. But Pope Francis is saying we have a responsibility to call it out. We have a responsibility about the information we're receiving. If we know it's fake, we need to tell people it's fake, because if we don't, they may not know, And so a lot of what he mentions in all of these messages on communication is about having the courage to get out in the street and to stand up for what we believe in. And this is one of those examples. We have to expose it if we know it's fake. Go and see, he says. Get out into those streets. Go see what's true and what's not true. I sit at home a lot and I think about, well, I probably should be out there doing something or whatever, but where would I go and what would I see? And I won't know until I get out there. So hard for somebody like me who's a homebody, enjoys being home. But I really do think, if you think back on the life of Pope Francis as Pope especially, was always on the move and always working. Probably needed to rest more. probably needed to model resting more than he did, but we do need to go out and see for ourselves what's going on in the world, whatever world we're concerned about. And there are people who live it every day who could tell us if we bothered to ask, if we bothered to listen. Share the truth. Go out and see. Expose the fake news. Go out and see the world, and whatever you find there that you believe to be true, share that truth. I've been a little, I think, surprised at how much Pope Francis says we need to share things. And he's talking online, social media, online, the internet. He's suggesting that we use the digital highway and get out on those streets as well as the streets outside, but to share the truth. He has mentioned, I heard him mention before, when you receive a message from God, share it, and it takes courage. It really takes courage to share the truth. And sometimes people use that word truth when they know absolutely they're not telling the truth. That word gets misused a lot too. Nothing can replace seeing things firsthand. I have a friend who said, what was her grandmother said, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see, I think, was the saying. And I think that's true. So even if you're in the streets, face to face and seeing and hearing something, you might could only believe half of that. But that firsthand knowledge is more trustworthy than anything you're going to see online or through a text message or whatever. Yeah, it's a crazy world we live in. Communicate not just with words, but also with our eyes, with our tone of voice and our gestures. He's reminding us that when we're face to face with people, gaining this firsthand knowledge, like Jesus did, that it's not just our words. It's sometimes in the silence. It's by the look in somebody's face. It's by the body language that they're making in the tone of voice. You can't hear a tone of voice in an email. And sometimes I'm one of those people that try not to write long emails. I get a lot of long emails, but I try not to write them, and because mine are so short, they probably come across abrupt or too direct or something, even though I attempt to be nice about it. But you don't hear tone of voice in an email unless Grammarly's helped you with it, probably. And sometimes a lot of people are not as sensitive as others, but sometimes people are so sensitive that they hear something in your tone that you don't even mean to be there, but it might be truthful. Hard to say. Only you would know. The word is effective only if it engages us in dialogue. I think he's making a very valid point here that words are great, but if I'm speaking thousands of words to you like I am right now, am I helping us have dialogue? Maybe not. Maybe I need to rethink this. But if the point of the words are to get us out into the street, to inspire us to get out, to meet face to face, to have dialogue, to engage with one another, then the words are effective. Otherwise, it's just words. We're relational beings. The whole point is to be in relationship with God and with others. And I've got friends who would argue with me about that. But it's true, right? And we experience God through others, and others experience God through us. And they're probably not going to with a monologue, because then they're just going to glaze over. And dialogue is way more engaging. Storytelling is more engaging than a monologue. Empty rhetoric abounds, he says, in business and politics, speaking an infinite deal of nothing. Just a lot of words, people talking, rambling on, saying nothing, just to persuade, which is actually, empty rhetoric is not very persuasive anyway. So it's basically sounds like just people talking to hear themselves talk, which I hope I'm not doing right now, but this is nothing. It's nothingness. If I'm watching a television show and I'm really engaged in it, it's because a character is transforming. And I can get so engaged that I will boo-hoo about it. If a TV show starts with two characters who don't get along at all, and we watch them through a whole season, and then at the very end, if something happens that causes one of them to run across the room and hug the other one, which happened on Ted Lasso. Spoiler, should have said spoiler. Then yeah, I'm going to bawl because both characters have had some deep transformations, and that's what we're talking about being engaging. And so basically I'm saying if you're not having a transformation, then you probably just got empty rhetoric. You've just got a lot of words, and it's nothing. It's an infinite deal of nothing if it's not you transforming or you helping other people transform in a positive way. The good news spread person to person, heart to heart around the world, he says. The good news was just not somebody standing up there rattling off words. It was spread face to face, person to person, heart to heart, not mind to mind, but heart to heart, which means creating a meaningful feeling, a purposeful feeling. There we have a lot of feelings that are not necessarily trustworthy or good if we're just running around feeling sorry for ourselves or whatever. You can have lots of feelings that are not necessarily, I don't even think those are in your heart. Those are in your ego, when you're being a poor me too much about life and complaining and blaming and all that. That's very egotistical. We might call them emotions, but I'm not saying those are living in the heart. So the stuff that lives in the heart is love, it's joy, it's peace. It's all those fruits of the Spirit. And so the good news, which was hopeful, it was conquering death, right? It was God, we are made in the image of God. That's the good news that was spread, and this is how it was spread. Those who witness Christ shine with a surplus of humanity. And I think I paraphrased that, but he was basically saying, Pope Francis was saying, when people witness Christ in their lives or wherever, then they begin to shine with a surplus of humanity. So it's really interesting how divinity comes to earth, becomes humanity, and then helps us have more humanity. It took divinity to create humanity and then to come and bless humanity to give us more humanity. But if we're not having, there's like this thing going around now where we shouldn't have empathy, where people think we shouldn't have empathy. I think what they're saying is you shouldn't sabotage somebody by overhelping them. Fine. You shouldn't sabotage people by underhelping them either. We all need a certain amount of help. Nobody's an island, right? We all have to function together and live together. You can overhelp and sabotage, underhelp and sabotage, and so we need that right balance. It's not about compromise so much as it's about balance. And I think we've been called to have compassion, to suffer with. And so part of being human is to suffer. Part of being a part of humanity is to suffer with others. And I think people who just want to cut all that off and be very utilitarian, that's robotic and you're not feeling it all. And so that is not Christ. to me. I don't believe that that's Christ. When you are experiencing Christ, then you are going to be more compassionate, and again, not in the over helping sabotaging way, and also not in the under helping sabotaging way, but in the just exactly right amount of balanced help to help humanity. St. Paul would have certainly used email and social messaging, Pope Francis says. I thought that was funny and probably true. St. Paul wrote many letters and sent those letters, and somebody the other day said he probably didn't realize they were going to be a part of the Bible and read for many, many years after that. But he was a letter writer, and so sure, he would probably have been an email writer too, given the chance, or might have been on TikTok. We don't know. We won't know, but that made total sense to me. And he was about evangelization and missionary work and spreading the gospel and the good news, and so sure. But if it was Paul's hope, faith, hope, and love that made an impression. It wasn't just his words. So even though today he might use email and social posts to get his message across, keep in mind that it's actually the faith, hope, and love pouring from his heart that made the impression on the people who were, I heard the other day, maybe it was in a Richard Rohr book, that when he was writing to the Ephesians or whatever, that might have only been 40 people in a house church, not necessarily a lot. But he made an impression through his faith, hope, and love, according to Pope Francis. He was spreading a message of salvation. I think when I was growing up, that whole word salvation to me just seemed to mean you had to be baptized so you could go to heaven. I didn't grow up Catholic, and so that word just seems kind of funny to me. But I think if you're thinking about salvation being a conversion of heart to make you more Christ-like, so that you're on purpose, on path for God, doing God's will, your little part in the world, and that makes you of service and loving others, and that makes your heart open and warm, and that gives you the docility to the Holy Spirit. That's salvation on earth. That's finding love and joy and peace and everything on earth, even in the midst of suffering. And so that message of salvation is not necessarily about what happens when you die and hopefully go to heaven or whatever. So it's different to me now than it used to be. Encounter people where and as they are. Pope Francis's message in this 55th World Communications Day was about meeting people where they are. And I have mentioned before that I teach communication, and that's all about meeting people where they are. And so where people are now, fortunately or unfortunately, might be on social media, but when we're encountering them there, our goal, our job, our mission, according to Pope Francis, is to get them to meet face to face and have a personal encounter. Teach us, this is his prayer, teach us, God, to move beyond ourselves and set out in search of truth. Move beyond our tiny little piece of the world, our tiny little view of the world. Help us see beyond that to find truth, because we're not going to just find truth barricaded behind our one news source and staying home and only talking to people who agree with us. That's not going to help us find truth. Teach us to go where no one else will go. That's eye-opening, isn't it? There are places that have people and who need assistance and service and ministry to be helped in physical ways, mental ways, emotional and spiritual ways. Teach us to go where no one else will go. Do we have the courage to do that? Do I? I don't know. But Pope Francis is saying this should be our prayer. Grant us the grace to recognize your dwelling places in our world and the honesty needed to tell others what we have seen. So he's asking us to ask God to grant us the grace to be able to see God in the world, where God is dwelling. God is everything in everything, but God shines through brighter in certain people and certain places and certain things and ministries. Help us to see your dwelling places in our world and give us the honesty needed to tell others what we have seen, and not just honesty, but courage, right? Help us to see you, Lord, in others, wherever you are, and then help us have the honesty and courage we need to tell others what we've seen. All right, that was 55. Thank you.